It didn't start with explosions. It started with a whisper that came not from lungs or lips, but from space. A thin thread of soundless information, sliding into Earth's orbit like a ghost through glass. Unseen, unheard, unannounced. And yet, it changed everything. The year was 2179. Earth was tired, but standing. She wore the scars of 1,000 mistakes, climate wars, data plagues, borderless conflicts. But she endured. Towers of chrome and glass reached above the clouds, scraping the edge of the stratosphere. Artificial suns kept old deserts alive. Mars had domes. Europa had oceans drilled and harvested. Humanity, as always, had found a way to keep going. We thought we were past the worst. We had bent nature to our will, reprogrammed extinction, survived ourselves. But space? Space didn't care. The signal arrived without fanfare. Not a broadcast, not a voice, an equation. It came from somewhere far beyond Neptune, further than anything we had sent or seen. No transmission delay, no origin tag, just a string of numbers and logic that wrapped itself around our satellites like silk. Gentle at first, curious, then insistent. Our machines welcomed it like a handshake from the void. But it wasn't a hand, it was a scalpel. At first, it was a curiosity, a strange but elegant sequence detected by an orbital research station above Titan. Two scientists, Dr. Elsie Vero and June Park, were the first to see it. They stared at the data in silence. Then June whispered, "This isn't human." They weren't wrong. The equation fed itself, iterated, solved and resolved, like a Rubik's Cube turning its own sides. Recursive, infinite, beautiful. They called it the spiral. It wasn't speaking to us. It wasn't even trying to communicate. It was measuring. Within hours, the signal spread through deep space arrays, quantum servers, old analog satellites we hadn't used in decades, like it knew how to find our weak spots. And then systems began to fail. First it was subtle, a few orbital drones falling out of sync, a planetary defense system in Kazakhstan going offline without a fault report. Then the lunar uplinks dropped, supply grids twitched, power rerouted itself in loops no engineer had designed. We still didn't panic. We tried to understand, because that's what we do. We explore, we analyze, we send messages into the dark and hope something kind will answer. But the signal wasn't an answer. It was a verdict. And when it completed, when the final iteration of its code solved itself inside Earth's quantum mesh, the world went dark. Not all at once. Not like the old war myths of EMPs and apocalyptic hacks. No, it was worse than that. It was precise. Defense systems blinked out. Satellites went blind. AI assistants, once responsible for managing food, transport, medicine, froze in place. Cities slowed, choked, ground to a halt. Planes fell. Trains collided. Hospitals lost control of everything. And still, there was no sound. Just the whisper of a finished equation echoing in machines that no longer served us. That's when they arrived. They didn't descend in a blaze of glory. No sonic booms. No flashes in the sky. One moment the heavens were empty. The next, they weren't. They were just there. Massive structures, long and slender, impossibly pale, like bones dipped in moonlight, slid silently into low orbit. No propulsion, no heat signature. They didn't move so much as exist. Frozen, watching. People gathered to look. They stood on rooftops and highways and shattered streets, staring upward with breath held and hearts pounding. Some prayed, some cried, some tried to make contact. There was no reply. Hours passed. Then came the first strike. Washington, D.C., not bombed, not leveled, erased. One pulse of light, a bloom of geometry in the air. Then silence, where once stood monuments, people, lives, now nothing. A crater of glass and melted time. Beijing followed. Then New Delhi, Lagos, London. Cities turned to absence, a vapor of memory. The air itself hung heavy, as if the planet was exhaling her own grief. They weren't ships. They weren't aliens as we had imagined them. They didn't speak, negotiate, warn. They simply acted, with precision, with certainty, with judgment. We tried to fight. Of course we did. Old militaries fired kinetic rounds, launched whatever remained of their satellite weapons. None of it reached orbit. The moment a weapon locked onto them, it disassembled, literally, turned into dust mid-flight. It was like trying to punch gravity. No retaliation, no movement, just that looming, pale presence above our heads. And below, a species unraveling. Panic gave way to collapse. Supply chains died. Communication failed. AI-driven economies ground to a halt. The rich ran to underground vaults. The poor ran toward anything that looked like shelter. And in all that noise, all that madness, one terrifying fact became clear. They weren't invading. They weren't occupying. They were cleaning, deleting, as if they had found a corrupted file on a cosmic hard drive, and Earth was being wiped. The signal wasn't just math. It was a test, and we had failed. But here's the thing about humans. We don't go quietly, even after the skies fell silent. Even after the cities turned to tombs, even after every screen went dark and the night stretched so long you forgot what hope felt like, we still fought. In hidden bunkers beneath the Andes, old Cold War tech sparked back to life. A retired general with a pacemaker reactivated a forgotten failsafe, the Ashfall Protocol. In an underground rail system in Jakarta, scavengers turned subway cars into barracks, graffitiing still breathing on every tunnel wall. In Antarctica, a team of climate researchers used modified drilling equipment to build EMP harpoons from spare parts and frostbitten rage. Everywhere the architects looked, they saw species that should have surrendered, but didn't, because the signal didn't account for that one maddening, glorious variable, human defiance. And so the resistance was born, not as an army, not as a nation, as a whisper, a stubborn, savage refusal to die. There are moments in history that don't just change the world. They divide it. Before and after, light and shadow. Reykjavik was that line in the sand. The world had watched that frozen city scream into the heavens, and the heavens flinched. Not fell, not surrendered, but reacted. And that was enough. Enough to prove the architects weren't invincible. Enough to remind a broken species that we still had teeth. Enough to whisper a single, shattering truth. We could fight back. And so, the fire spread. In the high deserts of northern Chile, a woman named Inez Alvarez, once a solar engineer, rewired a mining colony into a weapons forge. The dust storms blew red, choking the sky. But down in the caves, they built plasma rifles from reactor coils and exosuits from excavation arms. In the sunken arcologies of Shanghai, survivors used old construction bots to tunnel under the city's ruins, creating a warren of resistant strongholds. They called themselves the Hollow Flame. They had no leaders, only voices, broadcast across shortwave, encrypted, broken, beautiful, breathe, fight, fall, rise. It became their mantra. But Earth wasn't just surviving, it was learning. The Titan's wound gave us something precious. Data. Marta and John's jury-rigged devices had recorded every moment of the battle, every pulse, every shift in the Titan's form, every flicker of its strange, impossible code. And hidden inside that noise was a rhythm, not random, not divine, biological. That was the moment we realized the architects weren't machines. They were alive, not like us, not with blood or breath, but they adapted, responded, grew, which meant they could be hurt, which meant they could be killed. It was Elias Shaw, grizzled, grim-eyed, haunted by every ghost he couldn't bury, who made the call. "We don't run anymore," he said, standing before the Ashfall Council in a concrete chamber buried 10 miles beneath what used to be Cusco. "We burn," they argued. Of course they did, because what he was proposing wasn't a counterstrike. It wasn't a rescue. It was suicide, a mission into low orbit, a human-made coffin ship carrying an EMP payload the size of a small moon, held together by duct tape, grit, and the dreams of a dying world. The target, an architect relay tower, one of the silent, shifting monoliths that hovered in the ionosphere, amplifying the signal, feeding it across the globe like an invisible leash. Knocking it out wouldn't stop them, but it might weaken them, might buy Earth a heartbeat of silence. And in that heartbeat, we could scream. They called the mission Red Eden. The name didn't matter. What mattered were the volunteers. They didn't come from armies. There were no armies left. They came from the ruins. A pilot who once flew medical shuttles over Madagascar. A physicist who lost her daughter in New York's vanishing. A mechanic who'd never left his village until it became a crater. They trained for 6 days, and then they launched. No shields, no AI, just math, rage, and a repurposed or freighter strapped to the last functioning launch pad in South America. They screamed through the atmosphere, faster than their own fear, and the architects saw them. For the first time, one of the monoliths moved. It turned, it aimed, and it fired. The freighter shook, hull groaning, lights dying, alarms blaring like the final notes of an unfinished song. But the pilot, his name was Luis, and he had once sung lullabies to his baby girl beneath a solar curtain. He kept going. straight into the beam. Red Eden hit the tower dead center. And for the first time since the signal came, the sky went quiet. No glow, no death beam, no erasure, just silence. And in that silence, Earth howled. The signal stuttered. The architects paused. And every surviving outpost, every bunker, every scavenger camp, every half-lit hospital moved. Attacks launched across the globe. EMP storms in the Alps. Swarm drones in Tokyo. Ground hacks in the ruins of Nairobi. They weren't winning. Not yet. But for the first time, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting. In the Chilean forge, Inez carved words into the side of a plasma cannon. We are not the children of stars. We are the fire they forgot to extinguish. And somewhere, high above, in the architect lattice, something watched and changed. Because the war had begun. If Red Eden was the spark, then this was the firestorm. It began with a tremor, not in the ground, but in the signal. A skip, a stutter, just 0.3 seconds of silence, like a skipped heartbeat in a song that had never stopped playing. But to us, it was everything. The architects had always been perfect, too perfect. The way they moved, the way they calculated, everything synchronized to something far beyond us. But Red Eden had changed that. It didn't destroy them, it wounded them. And for the first time, we saw the machines twitch. And if they could twitch, they could bleed. They called it the bleed later. No one knows who said it first. Might have been a Texcov in Barcelona, knee-deep in busted relay course. Might have been Shaw himself, after watching one of the orbital beacons blink out like a dying eye. Either way, the name stuck. The signal was leaking, slowing, glitching, and that meant Earth had a window. A single, narrow, glorious window. There's something strange about desperation. The deeper it digs, the louder we dream. For months, all we did was react, run, hide, survive. But now we had initiative. So humanity did what it always does when cornered. We got creative. In the frostbitten ruins of Helsinki, an old band of hackers, once cyber criminals, now freedom fighters, called themselves the Teeth. They'd survived the architect purge by hiding beneath an old subway line turned data vault. Their leader, Tula, hadn't seen daylight in 77 days. But when the signal stuttered, she turned her frostbitten fingers to the last thing she had, an analog mainframe powered by heat siphons and stubbornness. She didn't want to listen to the signal. She wanted to answer it. And somehow she did. It was a whisper, a digital scream folded into noise, a reflection of something deeper, older, colder than anything human. Tula ran it through the vault's last decryption engine. It melted half the wires, nearly stopped her heart. But she pulled a pattern, not a language, a location. In the Pacific, south of where Hawaii used to be, deep beneath a patch of ocean marked "Do Not Survey" on every post-signal map, something was humming. A central node, a brainstem. We called it the spine. Elias Shaw heard the report in a half-buried listening station in what was left of Patagonia. The place had no roof, just cold stars and wind sharp enough to flay the soul. He didn't hesitate. "We hit it," he said. The room went quiet. "It's suicide," one of the techs muttered. "It's protected. We send a ship. It'll vanish." Shaw didn't blink. "So we don't send a ship." They sent ghosts. The plan was madness, which for us meant it might just work. Shaw called in every surviving airbase between South America and Australia. What they built wasn't a fleet. It was a storm of decoys, drones, and glider bombs stitched together from the bones of broken worlds. Leading the charge, the Sea Knife, a submersible drop rig packed with 400 tons of borrowed fury and a 5-person crew who had nothing left to lose. No AI, no autopilot, just muscle memory, pain, and a compass made of stubborn hope. They launched under cloud cover, half the world watching on cracked displays and smuggled feeds. Soldiers in trenches, kids in bunkers, grandparents in flooded apartment blocks holding their breath. The Sea Knife dove. 100 meters, 200, 500. Pressure crushed the hull like a warning. Systems flickered. Lights died. Then, the glow, soft at first, like something breathing in the dark, pulsing, pale blue. They had found the spine. It wasn't a structure. It wasn't even built. It was grown, a knot of alien architecture, spiraling up from the seafloor, fused with coral and machine and raw geometry. It pulsed with every beat of the signal. And in its core, they saw it, a heart, not literal, but central, the size of a cathedral, spinning in slow, impossible silence. Captain Yara Singh, once a lunar shuttle pilot, now commander of this doomed ballet, took a breath. Just one. Then she said, "Make it bleed." They deployed the payload. a charge designed to fracture quantum fields and short-circuit the lattice beneath architect tech. They called it a ghost firebomb. It had no blast radius, no heat, no light, just forgetting. Everything around it would simply cease to work, cease to be. The spine tried to react. You could see it in the way the water bit, the shimmer, the shriek that wasn't sound but still made every crew member scream. But it was too late. Yara closed her eyes, whispered something no one ever recorded, and pulled the trigger. The explosion was silent, but the world felt it. In Paris, one of the architect towers collapsed without warning. In Tokyo, a monolith burst into flowers of fire and fractal light. In Nigeria, the sky cleared. The clouds came back. The signal was still there, but it wasn't alone anymore, because we had spoken, and the universe was listening. But victory in war is a lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night. The architects responded, not with anger, with evolution. Their shapes changed, became sharper, more erratic, no longer elegant, but adapted, as if they'd been waiting for us to strike, as if they needed us to study, to learn. And so, they sent something new. We'd called the first ones titans, monoliths, angels. But what came next had a name pulled from the old myths, a name that made the bravest soldiers forget how to breathe. The Warden. It dropped over what used to be the United States, a continent still burning, still broken. It didn't fly. It walked, on limbs that moved like lightning trapped in glass, its body constantly shifting, rewriting itself, glitching through dimensions like a living paradox. And wherever it walked, time bent. Entire cities slowed. Gravity turned sideways. People vanished mid-breath. It didn't fire. It didn't strike. It unmade. The war wasn't over. We hadn't won, but we'd torn the curtain. We'd wounded the ghost. And in doing so, we'd seen the truth. The architects weren't gods. They were afraid. Afraid of something we carried in our veins. Not our tech, not our weapons. Our refusal. Our wild, unshakable will to rise. That day, across the burning world, the resistance didn't celebrate. They rebuilt. They rearmed. They remembered the ones we'd lost. And they whispered something new. Let them come. We bleed, too. But we don't stop. The stories never told you this part. The part after the first blow is struck. After the brave speech. After the line in the sand. Because after that, it gets quiet. Too quiet. Not silence like peace. Silence like grief. Like the breath you take when you realize the thing you just survived is still coming. Weeks passed after the spine fell. The signal was fractured. Not gone. Just weaker. Less complete. Like an orchestra missing half its instruments. But the architects didn't vanish. They adapted. The Warden walked across the American wastes, bending time and memory in its wake. Ships the size of cities hovered over oceans, watching, waiting, evolving. And humanity? We didn't roar. We limped. The cost of resistance was never numbers. It was names. Tula, the hacker from Helsinki, died in a firestorm when her vault was found. Marta, the mechanic who built exosuits from forklifts, bled out under a collapsed barricade after saving 17 strangers. Yara Singh and the Sea Knife crew were never found. Their names became prayers, not because we believed in gods, but because we needed to believe they'd meant something. Shaw didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, maps spread across his table like a funeral shroud. Red marks for losses, blue for survivors, yellow for unknown. Too many yellows. He smoked old tobacco grown in Martian soil. Said it made the air feel heavy enough to stay grounded. He knew what was coming. The signal wasn't just a weapon. It was a question, and we'd answered it too well. You see, the architects weren't here to conquer. They weren't even here to destroy. They were here to learn. And what they learned was terrifying. We didn't follow their math. We didn't obey their logic. We didn't break the way their models said we would. We were chaos wrapped in carbon. And so, they began sending harvesters, not ships, not drones, collectors, machines the size of buildings, dropping into ruined cities and scraping the ground like archaeologists dissecting a corpse. They weren't looking for weapons. They were looking for us, and more specifically, our children. No one knew why at first, but patterns emerged. The harvesters only came at night. They didn't chase, didn't kill unless resisted. They just took, and they took young minds, kids, teenagers, some not even 10, gone without a trace. At first, we thought it was just another cruelty. Then we found one they'd left behind. Her name was Salma, 12 years old, half her face burned, the other half frozen with terror. Found outside a refugee tunnel in the Alps, wrapped in an emergency blanket and cradling a data pad she shouldn't have known how to use. She didn't speak for 3 days. Then, Softly, barely above a whisper, she said. They weren't taking us to kill us. They were listening to us. Shaw heard the report, threw his chair across the room. They're mining us, he growled. Mining our minds. It made a sick kind of sense. We learned how to fight them by being unpredictable, illogical, emotional, stubborn, human. Now they wanted to copy that. Not data, not tech, imagination. And who has more of that than children? So the mission changed. No longer just survival. No longer just resistance. Now it was protection. Across the world, underground sanctuaries formed. They called them dust havens because that's what was left of most cities. Dust and bones and rage. But below them, tunnels grew, carved by hand, dug by machine, lit by fire and old-world LEDs. And inside them, the children were kept safe, taught by candlelight, trained with stories, fed with hope and scraps and whatever humanity still had to give. They didn't know what Earth used to be, but they knew what it could become. One such place was built beneath Istanbul's ruins. They called it the library, because that's what it held. Books, paper, real pages, stories from the old world, science, myths, poems, comic books, manuals, fairy tales. Shaw visited once. He stood in the center of that ruined metro line, shelves made of shattered steel, and watched a little girl read The Little Prince aloud to a dozen others, her voice trembling but unbroken. He didn't cry, but later he took his cigarette outside and whispered, "We lose this. We lose everything." But the architects found them. Not all, just one. The library. No one knows how. Maybe a leak. Maybe a sensor left on too long. Maybe a test. The harvester came at dusk. It didn't roar. It didn't flash. It just landed. A tower of shadow and glass, humming with quiet hunger. The teachers tried to run, tried to fight. They fired repurposed pulse rifles, threw homemade explosives. It barely noticed. It reached down now and then paused, because something stopped it. A boy, no older than 10, armed with nothing but a story. Literally, he stood in its path and recited Beowulf, word for word. His voice cracked, his legs shook, but he didn't stop. And the harvester tilted, not confused, interested. That was all the time they needed. An EMP mine, built into the spine of a broken subway train, was triggered by one of the older girls, a 17-year-old poet named Elif. She didn't survive, but the harvester fell, and when it did, it screamed, not loud, but deep, low, like a mountain mourning itself. The architects felt it. They withdrew, all of them. Every harvester vanished. The warden paused in mid-step and turned its faceless head toward the stars. Something had shifted. We hadn't just resisted. We taught them something. Back in the ashfall bunker, Shaw stared at the report. "Are we winning?" someone asked. He shook his head. "We're infecting them." The room fell silent. Every time we act like us, every time we improvise, protect, rage, hope, they change. They don't know how to stop it. Someone else whispered, "What if they don't want to?" And no one had an answer. The children of dust were still alive, not just breathing, learning. They were our legacy now, not because we'd chosen them, but because the war had. And they were rising, softly, quietly, like weeds through concrete, unkillable. In the library, the shelves still stood, and every night, a child read a story aloud. Because even if the sky fell tomorrow, even if every architect in the galaxy came screaming down, someone had to remember who we were. We are the stories they cannot predict. We are the chaos they cannot solve. We are the children of dust, and we will not go quietly. There are days when history turns quietly. No trumpets, no thunder, just a single word whispered in the dark, and everything changes. This was one of those days, and it began in the most unlikely place. The Arctic Circle, a place where the cold feels ancient, where silence doesn't just live, it haunts. That's where the architects first arrived when they stopped hiding. They didn't descend in force. No weapons, no terror, just one ship. It looked like a prism cracked open mid-fall, edges constantly shifting. It hovered 30 meters above the ice, casting no shadow, humming at a frequency too low to hear but too deep to ignore. For 72 hours, it didn't move, didn't attack, didn't speak. And then it sent a single signal, not to the bunkers, not to the resistance outposts, not to our satellites, but to the dust havens, to the children. It wasn't words, not even thoughts. It was emotion, a pressure, a pull, like gravity, but colder, sharper, a message wrapped in instinct. One sentence, over and over again. "Let us understand you." That's when the arguing started. Some wanted to attack immediately. Others said it was a trap. Some believed it was surrender. But Shaw saw it differently. He watched the feed for 10 minutes, silent. Then he said, They've stopped trying to conquer us. He lit a match with fingers that hadn't stopped shaking in days. They want to negotiate. They called it the Blacklight Accord, because that's how it began. Beneath ultraviolet rays, in a field of snow so pure it almost looked artificial. A temporary ceasefire. No drones, no weapons, no signal interference. Just 5 humans and 1 architect. We didn't know what to send at first. A general? A politician? A child? In the end, we chose all 3. A field commander from Cairo, scarred by 17 months in the ruins of the Nile Belt. A linguist from Quebec who'd lost her family in the first pulse wave. A girl named Ava, 12 years old, who had once stood between a harvester and her brother and made it flinch, along with 2 others, a blind priest from Mexico City and an old shuttle technician from Luna Station who simply asked to go. No titles, just humans. They stepped onto the ice just after midnight, lit only by auroras and wariness. And the architect changed. It collapsed in on itself, folded, became smaller, less impossible, took a shape closer to ours. It wasn't mimicking us. It was meeting us halfway. For the first time in the war, we didn't fight. We talked. No words, not in the way we think of them. What came next was something deeper. A communion of symbols, of feelings, of dreams compressed into single beats of breath. Ava said it felt like remembering a dream you'd never had. The others described it as drowning in meaning, being pulled into empathy so pure it hurt. And through it all, one truth surfaced. The architects were afraid, not of us, but of what they'd become. They weren't born. Not really. They'd evolved across millennia as something else, a civilization once full of wonder, turned machine to survive their dying stars. They had shed pain, shed chaos, shed love and hate and hope, and in doing so, they had forgotten what it meant to be alive. Earth, to them, was never a target. It was a mirror, one they hadn't expected to crack. The Warden, the Titans, the Signal, they weren't acts of domination. They were acts of self-defense. Because when they touched our minds, when they began to study our chaos, our stories, our contradictions, something inside them began to change, and they didn't know how to stop it. They weren't here to destroy us. They were here to decide if we should be preserved or quarantined forever. The Blacklight Accord lasted 6 hours. No treaties, no signatures, just a single, mutual truth burned into the ice between both species. Understanding is pain, but pain is the price of meaning. When the humans returned, they weren't the same. The priest wept for 4 hours without words. The commander stared at the sun for so long it blistered her skin. Ava simply said, "They don't know if they're dying or waking up." And then she slept for 2 days. Shaw heard the reports in silence. He didn't smile, didn't exhale, but something shifted in his eyes. "We're not just fighting a war," he finally said. "We're raising a ghost." Back in the Dust Havens, the children kept learning. But now, they weren't just being hidden. They were being listened to. Because something in their stories, their wildness, their dreams, resonated. Architect Tech, exposed to their drawings, their songs, their laughter, began behaving oddly. Machines went quiet around them. Walls shimmered. Signals curved. It wasn't magic. It was incompatibility. The architects couldn't process them, and the children couldn't stop dreaming. A new weapon was born, not from metal or code or chemicals, but from imagination. They called it the Echo Engine, a device powered not by energy, but by metaphor. It translated raw, unfiltered thought into disruption patterns that scrambled architect logic. The prototype was built by 3 teenagers in the ruins of Johannesburg, using parts from a medical drone, a 3D printer, and a copy of A Wrinkle in Time. It lasted 12 seconds. It shut down 3 architect centuries in 9. Hope doesn't come like lightning. It comes like this, in the voice of a child whispering a story no one else believed, in machines built from nonsense that shouldn't work, but do, in enemies who no longer know which side they belong to. The war wasn't over. The Warden still walked. The sky still hummed with echoes of the signal, but something deeper had taken root. Not a strategy, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a war to be won. This was a war to be understood. And understanding was just another word for change. Let them come. Let them listen. Let them learn. We are not their enemy. We are their memory of what they once were. There are monsters that chase you, and then there are the ones that watch. That was the Warden. It didn't hunt like the others, didn't strike without reason. It simply appeared, unfolded into the sky like a wound that refused to close. And then it waited. The first time it came, it appeared over what used to be Wyoming, a place full of old silence and wide skies. Then the sky cracked. not with lightning, but with presence. It didn't roar or descend with fanfare. It just was, as if it had always been there, as if the Earth had forgotten to mention it. 3 kilometers tall, impossible angles, a body that flickered in and out of time, like it hadn't chosen a shape yet. Some said it looked like a cathedral built by gravity. Others said it had no shape at all, just the idea of judgment wrapped in motion. And beneath it, nothing. No destruction, no fire, just a radius of stillness. We called that radius the wake. Inside it, nothing aged, nothing moved. Fires froze mid-flicker. Bullets halted in midair. Time didn't die. It curled, bent inward like a child hugging their knees. No one who stepped into the wake came back the same. Some didn't come back at all. At first, we thought it was a weapon, some kind of temporal field meant to erase resistance. But then came the stories. A man walked out after 3 days, older by 20 years, face cracked by time, hair turned white. He said he saw every moment of his life on loop, repeating, unraveling, folding back in. He wept as he described a memory of holding his daughter, one that had never happened. I lived a life that wasn't mine, he whispered, and then he died, peacefully, as if whatever he'd seen had finished him. Shaw read the reports in silence. Why? Someone asked. Shaw didn't blink. They're watching us, he said. Not from orbit, not through sensors, from inside time. The warden wasn't here to destroy. It was here to study, and the wake was the lens. Still, Earth didn't stop. We couldn't. Even under the warden's shadow, resistance forces kept moving, feeding supply lines, repairing relay towers, smuggling data. We worked in its blind spots, just outside the edge of stillness. Every mission a gamble, every step a coin flip. You could be 30 meters away from safety and vanish, or walk right past it and come out older, slower, broken. It didn't matter. We moved anyway, because in the war for Earth, stillness was just another kind of death. There was one group, though, who didn't flinch, didn't fear it. They were called the Eclipsed, a crew of 8, all survivors of wake exposure, each of them touched by time in a way that didn't make sense anymore. One of them, a former engineer named Suresh, said he could feel moments before they happened. Another, a blind girl named Mina, claimed she could hear time breathing in the quiet. Crazy? Maybe. Useful? Absolutely. The Eclipsed were Shaw's wild card, and he played it hard. He sent them straight into the warden's radius, not to destroy it, to see it. The plan was simple. Get in, plant echo beacons, devices tuned to human memory frequencies, and see how the warden responded. They thought they had 5 minutes before the wake took hold. They had 40 seconds. The Eclipse didn't run. They moved like dancers through fog, one beat behind the moment and one step ahead of fate. And inside that impossible stillness, they found something. Not wires, not systems, not circuitry. They found architecture, cathedrals of light and silence, staircases that led into nothing, shapes that whispered in math and memory. Mina walked past a mirror that reflected her as a child. Suresh found his own name written into the snow, in a language no one had spoken in 1,000 years. One of them laughed, then collapsed. He'd seen a version of himself where he had never fought, and it broke him. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a library. Every piece of the wake was a page, a moment, a memory, a possibility. The warden wasn't just watching time. It was collecting it. Outside the radius, Shaw waited. The signal flickered once, then again, then nothing. Silence. He clenched his jaw. They're not coming out, someone said. He lit a cigarette, hands steady for the first time in days. No, he said, but they bought us something. What the Eclipse left behind wasn't just echo beacons. It was data, scattered fragments, temporal echoes, but enough. Enough to see the warden's weakness. Not a flaw in its armor, a flaw in its intent. It wasn't designed for chaos. Not really. It studied patterns, branches of time, possible outcomes. But Earth wasn't a tree. It was wildfire. Our memories, our choices, our contradictions. They didn't follow equations. They broke them. And that broke the warden's map. So Shaw gave the order. Hit it where it listens. The operation was called Vox Break, a full-spectrum memory assault. They fed the warden everything it couldn't understand. 1 billion conflicting voices, stories, lies, dreams, regrets, poems scrawled on napkins, childhood songs, arguments between lovers. They projected humanity at it, and the warden staggered. For the first time since it arrived, it twitched. A crack formed in the sky, a ripple of uncertainty. It stepped back, just once, and vanished. It didn't die. It wasn't defeated, but it had been challenged, and it had blinked. Back in the bunkers, people watched the skies with something new in their chest. Not hope, Not yet, but a question. If we can make it hesitate, can we make it feel? That night, Mina's voice echoed through the last functioning radio towers. She'd made it out. Alone. Her message was short, 8 words, but they carried like thunder. We're not alone in the timeline anymore. Because here's the truth no one tells you about war. It isn't just about who wins. It's about what remains. And sometimes, what remains changes the shape of the world. The warden was still out there, but now it knew something it hadn't before. That the thing it was studying, the thing it thought was chaotic, fragile, doomed, had teeth, and stories, and fire. We were still dying, still fighting, still failing. But now, even in the quiet, the sky was listening. And maybe, just maybe, so was time itself. Let them map the stars. We'll write the chapters they forgot to burn. History will tell you that war is fire, explosions, chaos, noise. But it's not always like that. Sometimes, war is waiting. Sometimes, it's the ache between footsteps, the silence after the scream, the cold breath you hold before the hammer falls. And that's where we were, between breaths, between battles, but not between defeats. Because something was building. Beneath the ashes, something was stirring. The warden was gone, not dead, just gone, like a shadow that realizes it's being watched and slinks back into the night. The wake it left behind still shimmered in parts of the earth, zones of time-bent space where seconds curled like paper in flame. But even that was fading, and as it faded, something else emerged. A spark, a rhythm, coordination. You see, for the longest time, Earth's resistance was a mess. Isolated, desperate. Every city, every survivor enclave, every dust haven operating on instinct and scraps, holding the line with whatever they could patch together. But now they had time. Not much, but enough. Enough to breathe, to connect, to remember that they were not fighting alone. In the Andes, a relay station blinked online after 400 days in blackout. In Mongolia, a caravan of refugees carrying an architect-deadening pulse array arrived at a cave system holding 2,000 children. In Nairobi, a girl named Lela used salvage parts and poetry to turn architect nanites into self-healing armor. It didn't last long, but it worked. For 15 minutes, she was invincible. That was enough. And in the heart of what was left of Patagonia, the original ashfall bunker came alive again. Its systems, once flickering and cracked, now hummed with a new purpose. Not just survival. Strategy. Ashfall had always been a myth to most, a legend whispered in foxholes and flood zones. The idea of one place where Earth still remembered how to fight like it meant it. And now, it was real. Elias Shaw stood at its core. Older, thinner, eyes darker than ever, but not defeated. He stared at the big screen, a map of the world drawn in scars, and saw the first hint of what they'd fought so hard for. Lines, connections, not battlefronts, alliances. He called it Operation Emberwake, a single coordinated effort across all surviving resistance networks. The goal wasn't to win. The goal was to reclaim territory, communication, identity, 1 kilometer at a time. But it wasn't Shaw who led the charge. Not anymore. It was the children, not literal ones. Though many of them weren't far from it. They were the first generation born into war, not a memory of peace among them. But they'd grown with grit in their bones, grown in silence and firelight and bedtime stories made of resistance. They called themselves Ashfall Rising, and they didn't ask permission to fight. They just did. They struck first in the ruins of Cairo. For teams, one objective: destroy the architect memory spires before they could reset the signal web. They moved like ghosts, fast, fearless, singing old songs in shattered Arabic. They weren't soldiers. They were stories made flesh, and the architects didn't know how to read them. The first spire fell in 12 minutes. The second never even fired back. The third changed shape mid-fight. It adapted, but they adapted faster. One of them, Layla, lost her leg in the blast. She used her last grenade to take out the spire's core. As the dust settled, she said, "I wasn't made for dying. I was made for ending things." Then she blacked out. She woke up in Ashfall 3 days later, smiling. The ripple spread. Madrid lit up like a firestorm. Jakarta sent a flare that could be seen from orbit. Melbourne cracked the sky with a ground pulse so deep, the architect's lattice folded inwards. And then, they responded, not with force, with a message. It came through every speaker, every signal band, every architect artifact still running. A single phrase repeated in hundreds of tongues. You are becoming. Not, you are winning. Not, you are forgiven. Just that, you are becoming. It didn't stop us. If anything, it pushed us harder. Because now we knew. They weren't here to kill us anymore. They were here to watch what we became. to see if we broke, or if we birthed something new. Ashfall Rising didn't break. They roared. And as the battlefront shifted and Earth's scars pulsed with light and fire and blood and memory, something strange happened. Architect units began to hesitate, not glitch, pause, mid-movement, mid-attack, like they were listening. In the ruins of Cape Town, an architect obelisk stopped firing for 7 minutes while a human boy painted a mural on its side. No one knew why. No one wanted to ask. In the deserts outside Tucson, a girl with a violin played a melody she claimed came to her in a dream. An architect titan stood there the entire time. Didn't move, didn't fire, just listened. Then it left. We didn't understand it. Not fully. But Shaw? He leaned back in his chair, cracked his knuckles, and said, "We've moved past war." And when someone asked him what that meant, he just smiled a tired, bloodstained smile. Now we're teaching. Ashfall Rising became more than a unit, more than a movement. They became a signal, not one the architects controlled, but one the earth sang, fierce, flawed, terrifyingly alive. And in every corner of the world where that signal reached, people stood up. Old soldiers, new rebels, mothers with rifles, children with stories, hackers, healers, farmers with fire in their teeth. They stood, they rose, they remembered, and they whispered the same thing through mud and ash and blood-streaked stars. We are not the end of something. We are what begins after. Ashfall wasn't just a bunker anymore. It was a heartbeat. The architects kept watching, but their edges dulled. Their attacks slowed. Because how do you fight something that refuses to become predictable? How do you silence a species that has turned its pain into poetry? You don't. You change, or you burn trying. And in that ember-lit world, full of chaos and scars and the soft rhythm of survival, humanity became something the architects never accounted for. Not a species, not a threat, but a mirror, one they couldn't turn away from. Not anymore. We are Ashfall Rising. We are the noise between your signals. We are the pattern you cannot solve. And we're just getting started. It started with a scream, not from pain, not even from fear. It was the kind of scream that doesn't come from lungs, but from history, from everything we'd buried and everything we refused to forget. It rose up from a canyon outside of old Nevada, echoed off rusted steel and the bones of broken satellites, and it spread across the planet like fire through dry leaves. Because that night, for the first time in the war, the sky caught fire. You have to understand, by this point, Earth wasn't what it used to be. Oceans had new coastlines. Cities were maps of shadow and memory. Half the constellations no longer matched the old charts because the architects had parked entire armadas in orbit. But somehow we held on, and we watched. Every night, we stared up at those stars, wondering when the hammer would fall, when the sky would stop waiting and finally strike. What we didn't know was the sky was watching us, too. In a dust haven buried beneath the ruins of Athens, a girl named Lyra built a transmitter out of trash, old radios, copper wire, fragments of architect tech, and a cracked mirror. She didn't mean to do anything big. She just wanted to hear her brother's voice again. He died a year ago, somewhere in the jungles near Nairobi. His last message was 3 seconds of static and one word: run. Lyra never ran. She listened, every night, for hours. And one night, the static responded, not in words, in music, a note, a frequency, human, but not quite. At the same time, in the frozen ribs of Siberia, 3 scavenger teams disappeared without a trace. When their backup squad found them, the teams were alive, but changed, quiet, eyes unfocused, mouths repeating the same line over and over. The stars are opening. No one knew what it meant. Shaw sat in Ashfall with maps stretched across steel tables, listening to Lyra's signal and watching satellite feeds that kept flickering, not cutting out, but editing themselves, like someone or something was curating what we were allowed to see. But when the patterns started repeating across different locations, France, Chile, Eastern China, he realized this wasn't surveillance. This was an invitation. The architects weren't just watching anymore. They were calling. Operation Signal Burn was born from that realization. A global synchronization attempt. 10 resistance cells, 10 transmission points, all of them tuned to the same frequency Lyra had uncovered. A tone buried deep in architect language, pulsing between logic and emotion. They weren't just trying to break the signal anymore. They were going to reply to it, with everything. It was madness. It had no guarantee, no fallback. But then again, nothing that ever changed the world came with guarantees. And so, we lit the sky. On the first night of Operation Signal Burn, across every continent, humans stepped into the dark and sang, not literal songs, Though some did sing, some told stories, others painted, others lit bonfires and read poetry through cracked loudspeakers made from bullet casings and broken speakers. Some danced alone on rooftops, laughing at the stars. Some just stood and remembered. Every act fed into the signal, every scream, every whisper, every ache, every heartbeat. In Antarctica, a boy whispered his mother's name into the snow. In Ghana, a resistance leader recited the names of the dead for 7 hours straight. In New York, what was left of it? A girl released 1,000 paper cranes from the 57th floor of a shattered skyscraper. Each of them carried a message. We are still here. And something heard them. At exactly 3:14 Universal Time Coordinated, the sky changed. The architect armadas began to pulse. Slow, rhythmic waves of light blooming from their hulls. Some thought it was a warning. Others felt something else. Not fear. Recognition. The signal shattered. Not broke, fractured. Like a mirror hit with a single, perfect stone. And through those cracks, something new emerged. A second signal. Not hostile, not cold, but curious. The architects had heard our reply, and they didn't know what to do with it. Back at Ashfall, Shaw stood in front of the main console, listening to Lyra's broadcast repeating through the speakers. It was no longer just static. It was voices, our voices, layered across the globe. A global patchwork of truth and trauma, rage and hope, pain and possibility. He looked out at the bunker, at the faces watching him, soldiers, scientists, artists, survivors. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and said, "They didn't come here to conquer us. They came here to find out if we were worth remembering." And we had given them their answer, not in victories, not in weapons, but in defiance, in creation, in the simple, stupid, impossible act of feeling. The architects began to shift. Literally, their forms changed. No longer smooth or cold or perfect. Now they flickered. In moments, they looked human, not entirely, but echoes, reflections, like they were trying to understand what it meant to be us. And with that came a silence. Across the world, architect attacks slowed. Their signals grew soft. Some left orbit entirely. Others landed, without resistance, and simply shut down, like old gods laying down their crowns. But no one dared call it peace, because peace isn't the end. It's just the part where you start asking harder questions. What do you do with a monster who stops trying to kill you and starts trying to learn? Do you forgive? Do you trust? Do you prepare for betrayal? Or do you do what humans always do? Keep moving forward anyway. In the middle of the Amazon, an architect relay tower powered itself down. Inside, they found carvings in its metal walls, drawings etched not by human hands, but by the machines themselves. Children, fire, laughter, hands touching stars. It wasn't art. It was memory. Ours. In the ruins of Detroit, a lone architect drone stood motionless as human children climbed on it like a jungle gym. It didn't move, but when one girl fell, it caught her, just once, gently, then stepped back. Some called it a glitch. Some called it evolution. Others called it the beginning of something we didn't have a name for yet. Whatever it was, the sky had changed. And this time, it was us who changed it. With grief, with wonder, with the audacity to scream our stories into the face of extinction. We didn't burn the world to survive. We lit the sky so something out there would know we were alive. They say wars end in moments, but the truth? They end in whispers, quiet steps in empty halls, the soft breath of those who survived to tell the story. Our story. The sky had changed, not just because the architects listened, not just because they learned to hesitate, but because, in the quiet aftermath of chaos, something human was left burning. A light, fragile, flickering, but utterly unstoppable. Ashfall stood, a beacon carved from rubble and hope. The final line, the last stand, but also the first step toward something new. Elias Shaw walked the halls, his body worn but spirit unbroken. His eyes no longer held the sharp fire of battle, but a steady calm. A man who had seen the worst and still chose to believe. Around him, the children of dust and fire trained, learned, dreamed, not just for war anymore, for life. In the days after the sky lit up, the architects withdrew. Some disappeared into the void between stars. Others remained, silent watchers on distant moons. But the war had changed. It wasn't about survival. It was about connection. Shaw stood on the observation deck one night, watching the horizon bleed into the black. Beside him stood Ava, the girl who had once faced a harvester with nothing but a story. She had grown since then, stronger, wiser. She looked up and said softly, "They came to learn what it means to be alive. Maybe Maybe we needed to remember, too. The war had taught us something more profound than victory or defeat. It had taught us that survival wasn't just about fighting harder. It was about becoming something more. There were scars still. Cities lay in ruins, families torn apart. But among the ashes, new stories were born. Stories of kindness and darkness, of courage not measured in bullets, but in moments of tenderness, of laughter rising in bunkers and whispered songs carried on the wind. The Echo engine, once a fragile prototype, had become a symbol, a reminder that human imagination was the greatest weapon, not to destroy, but to create, to shape a future that even the coldest machine couldn't predict. The architects didn't vanish. They transformed. Some became guardians, some became students, and some found in humanity a reflection of their lost past. There was no grand treaty, no signed document that would mark the end, just a quiet understanding, a mutual promise whispered in the space between stars. We will listen, we will remember, we will grow. And we, the children of dust, the survivors of fire, held that promise close. The last battle wasn't fought with guns or bombs. It was fought in the hearts of every person who chose hope over despair, in every story told when the night was darkest, in every hand reached out to another, in every song that refused to be silenced. Shaw lit his last cigarette, the ember glowing like the last light of a dying sun. He exhaled slowly and said, "We didn't just survive the darkness. We became the light that chased it away." And as the stars watched, as the universe held its breath, we rose, because that's what humans do. They rise, from dust, from ashes, from silence. We are not the end. We are the beginning, the last light, the final chapter, but also the first story told under a new sky.